Today we're looking again at the difference between leading from your heart and leading from your head, and whether the two mix, whether they're completely separate. Can you be somebody who is head-led but listens to your heart, and so on? And the reason that we're doing that is because all of us know the world has changed in these past few years. Many of us have become much more aware of the need to look at empathy, to look at in the workplace, making sure that people feel included and feel part of things. And there is a difference in how the world is being led now. But the thing is, unless we start looking at ourselves, unless we start actually listening to ourselves and living as we're meant to live, we can't change anything. And there's no good just looking at the big picture. We need to start looking at the smaller picture and where we are and our opinions and how things can change from the ground up, because truthfully, that's where the real change happens. So today, I'm delighted to have Glenda Mitchell with me. Thank you very much, Glenda, for coming to talk with us.
Hi, Angela. It's really good to speak to you again. Thanks for having me.
Well, you're very welcome. And just to start with, I would love you just to tell the listeners just a few minutes, just who you are, what you do, and so on, so they've got something to sort of tie into what you're saying.
I've got a corporate background, but I guess it links in closely with what we're talking about today. I've done project management and executive management, but it's always been about the people, and it's always been about how do we get the best out of people. So now I do more coaching. So I do corporate and individual coaching. I'm a published author, and I also do speaking and sort of MC engagements as well. So from a kind of motivational perspective.
Okay, that's really good. And the interesting thing for listeners will be to hear, I think, some of your perspective in the corporate side and the difference between corporate personal, whether there is a difference and so on. Because very often we can feel like you have to be head-led in the corporate space and heart-led in the personal space. And we were just beginning to talk before about the need to bring things together. So tell me how does that sit with you? Is there a difference? Can you be the same no matter where you are, or do you have to have a different take on things?
I think that the environment often demands that you are a little bit different, but I think that's what puts pressure on people, because at the end of the day, a person is an individual person. And I think the more we can integrate who we are and how we feel with the decisions we make and our work environment, the better it's going to be. So what I do see is where people are being different, say in the workplace versus at home, they live in that constant state of tension, which eventually becomes a stress that they can't cope with. So when a lot of the work that I do with people is really around the sort of values and what lights their fire, and around the emotional side and how to link that to help them make their decisions from a work perspective as well, so that I think they end up a bit more balanced when they can get all of that stuff sort of synchronized and in line with each other. I think it's when they're trying to do it differently or feel that they have to, that as people, they end up torn.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. One of the things that I find with many of my clients is they've listened to people who are apparently experts in a field that they know that they need some learning from. But what they've been taught doesn't sit in their heart. It doesn't actually feel comfortable. And so they find themselves conflicted because they're trying to follow a system that somebody who's probably successful, that's why they're teaching what they do. So it's like, well, they're successful, I've got to follow this system, but it's pulling me in two different directions. It's making me do something that doesn't feel good. And therefore, they can't sort of fulfill it to their, they can't reach their full potential. Often, that's in the sales side of things. And so it's finding the right way for them to be able to sell their services isn't necessarily by following the guru who apparently has been successful in it, but has a completely different method. And it sort of resonates with me when you're talking that that's probably a similar thing. They're trying to be somebody that they're not.
Yeah. I think you've described it really well. I think it's that old cliche, but it's so true, is one size doesn't fit all. And I think with anything in our lives, if we try and be someone else, it doesn't work. I'm the best version of myself, I'm not the best version of Angela. I'm the best version of Glenda. And I think the more we can come to terms with our own strengths, our own values, what's intrinsically within us, and link our decision making and our leadership and how we approach life to that, the happier we're going to be. But we're also going to be better, leaders, wives, mothers, whatever else we might be.
Yeah, it's important, isn't it? Now, I remember as a child being told that I was too subjective. And at the time, I didn't really know what they were talking about, but it was later on I realised, my dad particularly, if he thought emotions were directing decisions, then that wouldn't be appropriate for him. He would call that subjectivity, and it wouldn't really have a place, particularly not in things like career development, that sort of area. It wasn't that he was telling us not to be emotional, but there was a time and a place for emotion. There was a time and a place for being very objective. But really, the two are interlinked, aren't they?
They are. It's interesting you say that. Suddenly, the last week, and I'm not going to profess to be an expert on objectivity, but the last week or two, suddenly somebody actually, I was in a conversation with someone and they said objectivity is a myth and the scientists have proved it. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. That's kind of how I think, because I think life tends to be on a spectrum. There's very little it's this or this. There's usually, especially in complex things like this, there's usually a spectrum where people sit. So I started exploring this concept of objectivity being a myth. And interestingly enough, objectivity, and again, I'm not professing to be an expert, but there are some books written on it. And when there's people that wrote a book called Objectivity, and they stated that objectivity as a topic only came out when we started doing photography in I think it was the 19th century, when before then, everything was expressed as an ideal. And then suddenly when it became when we had photos, they were actually going to be absolute representations of the truth. And then funnily enough, if you look at a photo on a camera, say on the iPhone, if you take a photo of a sunset, it doesn't look like the sunset. So there's actually a bias even when we do it on an instrument. With our own eyes, we actually see things totally differently. How I see a sunset, how I see something is totally different to what you would, based on my experience of how many sunsets I've seen before or whatever. And it's the same with everything that we do. So from a scientific perspective, they've said that nothing is really there that's unbiased. So we are always bringing our frame of reference, our emotions. So to say that you can be perfectly objective and never subjective is kind of almost like saying that we can be not human at some point in our lives when we're making a decision. So I think we've done a disservice to people by saying subjectivity, I'm getting, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting or misstating your father, but subjectivity is not necessarily bad, but sometimes we say it's a bad way to make decisions. But the reality is, if you look at, you've probably bought a house. When people buy a house, they work out there's going to be 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, and that's what they have to have. They walk into the house, they fall in love with the house, and I walk out and suddenly discover that actually there are only 3 bedrooms in that house, and they've actually just bought it because they walked in and it was just the house that they fell in love with. Was that the right decision or wasn't it? Good question. So I think with whatever decision we make, there's probably likely to be some objectivity, but there's always going to be subjectivity because we are emotional people. And I think the more we can come to terms and accept that and work with it rather than fight it, probably the better decisions we'll make and the happier we'll be.
Yeah, I love the example of the house, and we bought a house in 2021, and we came from a house that was fairly modern. We'd had a big extension at the back, so the kitchen had gone from being kind of quite dark and dismal to being very bright and white and lots of light coming into it. And I loved that kitchen. And in my head, I thought that was going to be the thing that would direct me when choosing another house, because I had designed that kitchen. And then when it came to it, we looked at various houses, and I would go by my feelings, be like, no, I couldn't live here. There'd be something like just didn't feel that I could live in. Walked into this house that we're in now, which is a sort of 300-year-old cottage style. The kitchen is sort of an extended part at the back, and it's completely the opposite. It's really
Yeah.
quite dark. And would I want to change it at some point? Yes, I would if I could, because there's a much better way that would bring in more light. But I just knew, I felt at peace. I knew that this was a home, this was a house that could become my home. And that was the right decision. I'm very, very happy there. Where my husband would be more, I think he'd be more practical in his decision making. So for him, he would be looking at, well, is there a downstairs toilet for when I'm doing the gardening? Or those kind of things would be quite important to him. But even that, when you think about it, is still a sort of, there's still some subjectivity going on there because he's thinking about the enjoyment he has in the garden. That's
That's it.
still an important thing. So I
Yeah.
think looking at that kind of distinction and allowing ourselves to make those kind of decisions, it's very, very important. What about in leadership situations then in the workplace? How can our corporate leaders bring in that kind of, well, just the subjectivity or just the heart, really, the empathy and the understanding of their employees? How can they make a difference there?
Well, I think one of the things is by bringing in the heart, they're more likely to get the employees on board. So I worked for somebody as my manager, and I literally had people in my team saying that that person didn't have a heart. And so when this leader made decisions, everything very clever, very bright, very analytical, made decisions, but was struggling to get people on board. So we actually worked quite well together, I guess, because she probably would have seen me as the soft-hearted person. The leader, my manager was the very black and white kind of person. And together, she got decisions made. I got the people on board and we managed to move forward. The interesting thing, though, is that when things got very complicated and there were a lot of dimensions, what I found is that sometimes decisions didn't get made. And that's where I think sometimes objectivity can actually paralyze, because we can try so hard to get the perfectly objective decision. And because invariably, as we're trying to make that decision, there's things already changing and there's people involved. And we almost never get to make that decision. So I think because in the corporate environment, we're often having to make quite quick decisions, most times, even if we think we're not making it subjectively, it's a bit like your thing with your husband. I think there will always be an element of subjectivity in our decision making. So I guess I almost feel like let's acknowledge that there always will be, not try and be objective and work out how best we can do that.
Do you think that there's a more, like a greater willingness to kind of bring in that mixed style of leadership these days than there was before?
I think there is, because there's a lot of emphasis on values. And when they look at the definition of objectivity, a lot of the time that's what they say is it's actually values-free decision making. So basically it implies that you're trying to make decisions without taking values into account. Whereas a lot of organizations now are focusing a lot on values and what their values are and whether there's a synchronicity between their values and the people that they employ. So I guess by default, there is a recognition that values are important, which by implication then means that we're looking to actually use those values in driving organizations forward, which means their decision making.
Yes, do you think, I was just sort of thinking as you were talking as well about the difference between the leaders who are able to like leave their work in the office and whether they are more sort of head driven, if you like, as opposed to the leaders or business owners who can't leave their work in the office and who carry it around 24/7. Is that the difference between heart and head, or is that more just a personality style and an inability to actually maybe sort their life out, if that makes sense, and stop themselves going into overdrive?
That's a really interesting question. I can't say I've ever thought about that, but what you've just said seems logical to me. I'm probably one of those people that will always take the work. I've always been proud of the fact that I haven't physically taken my work home. I'd rather work late at work and then not do it at home when I'm not working from home. But the emotional part and the decision making and my concerns about the people and the decisions, I would take home with me. So yeah, that's a really good question. I need to ponder that a bit more. So, what do you think?
I'm just trying to think of people that I've worked with, and I can't leave my work in the office. Like you say, I've become much more determined to leave my computer in the office and not take that home with me, because when COVID struck, I went completely in some ADHD, and having the computer at home with me, having work at home with me, meant that I could not physically distance myself from it. It was just became overwhelming, really. And I'd be there like at 2 o'clock in the morning because I hadn't finished something. And so to help my own mental health and my own care, just care of myself, really, I recognized that I needed to stay later at the office if I haven't finished something. So sometimes it can be 8, it could even be 9 o'clock before I come home. But I need to leave it. I need to leave the physical capability of doing the work in the office. Otherwise, I'm just back on there again. But it does make me feel that I'm carrying my clients, I'm just carrying them safely in my heart, even if I'm not necessarily doing something practical for them. They're never far away from me. And I think there's a deep compassion and care for them to make sure that they succeed in what they want to do. But I've met other people who will literally shut the door, 5 o'clock, go home, completely different world. It's like they live in two different worlds. And I think on balance that they are more head led. They are more, they're just more kind of making decisions regardless. If they think it's the right thing to do, they will make it regardless. Not purposefully trying to hurt anybody. I don't think that's true. But they'll still make that decision, even if it actually has a negative impact on somebody else, or it might not be the decision that somebody else wanted them to make. And I'm thinking of a couple of people in the family, particularly in-laws, but it's not a criticism of them. It's just a different way, really.
Yeah, because it doesn't necessarily mean that their decision is better than yours either.
No.
Because they may change their mind when they go in tomorrow. They just decided to make that decision now based on what they knew, and then tomorrow they'll make a different decision. So it doesn't imply one way or the other. Yeah. And I guess that's what you were saying earlier, is it, whether it's by the heart or by the head, doesn't mean, again, one decision is better than the other. So it's really that combination of what do we need to take into account. And it does depend on the environment. It does depend on what the working environment is. If we're working in a more production line type of environment, then it's easier to kind of chug things through. A lot of it is about process. And at the end of the day, it's finished because you've finished making your widgets or whatever it is, versus kind of knowledge work, versus the work that you and I do, where it's actually really about the person. And the person doesn't shut down at 5 o'clock. The person still actually lives. So I guess it does also depend. And that's why we have different leaders in different types of environments. And some leaders work better in certain environments.
They do. And sometimes in a leadership position, there must be times when you have to make a decision, not regardless of the impact it's going to have, but knowing that the impact it will have will vary across the board, depending on who they're making that decision about. And I'm thinking particularly of world leaders, countries leaders, and so on, where we've got the big budget today that everybody's talking about. What's it going to be like? The country's in trouble and so on. How's it going to impact people? Now, I don't envy anyone in that role making that decision, because invariably there's going to be outcry from all sorts of people. That there's not going to be, I don't think today there'll be many people who'll be cheering, in fact, but I do think that there'll be people who feel hurt and hard done by more than others. And that's a tough place to be in, because you're putting yourself on the line. You know that you're going to be unpopular no matter really what you do. But you've got to make these decisions that balance the books for the nation. And I don't know how much you can let your sort of emotional, empathetic side come in there, really. What do you think?
I think we've got to be careful that we don't necessarily take that subjectivity equals emotion equals soft equals we're just trying to be nice to everybody. So I think even in that instance, there will be, because they will bring their biases and what they think the future is going to look like and the past has looked like. And an example would be, great example, if you've potentially got a change of government or a significant change in how the budget's happening, they're doing it based on their perception of what it was before. So if you're going to put in a very different budgetary system now to what there was, that's because you have certain perceptions. So is it objective or is it subjective? Is it a subjective bias because of how you felt about the previous one? So even there's a bias and a subjectivity involved. So I think there's making objective versus subjective decisions, and then there's the empathy, and then there's the I'm trying to keep everybody happy. And I think that's the one that's probably the most dangerous in leadership, is that I'm trying to keep everybody happy and I want to be popular, because that you can't do. So, well, most times. So I think for me, it's a case of building that empathy, being in line with our own values, being in line as far as possible with the organization values and the person's values, but still needing to make the decisions that may or may not be popular. I had a situation a number of years ago where I had someone in my team. She was a contractor. She'd been there for a little while. I sort of inherited her when I took over the team. And she had mental challenges, and she had a problem, and she ended up in hospital, and she was just paid on a daily basis. And one of my calls was whether we could actually keep her sort of coming back on part-time basis when she wasn't really contributing to the team. She was causing angst in the team, all of those kind of things, or whether I had to let her go because we only employed her on a daily basis. And it was one of the hardest decisions I could make, because I had pressures from all different directions. And from a personal perspective, I supported her and looked after her, but I was paid by the company. So I had to make decisions as well in line with that. And so there was a tension of my own values, of my own desires. And I look back and I made decisions that I needed to make. Were they right or wrong? You could have probably said some of it was right, some of it is wrong, but I made the decisions based on the best information and the best gut feel that I could at the time.
Yeah, I think, again, you're hitting something on the head there, because even in those decisions that are difficult, and that other people, being aware that other people are going to be looking in on them and saying, well, I wouldn't have done it that way. As long as, I think for me, as long as you recognize that there might be a fallout, or you recognize that the person or people that are going to be affected could be vulnerable in some way, emotionally could be affected by that decision. And as long as you're willing to sort of be open with them about either why the decision's been taken, or maybe there's some support they can be offered after a decision's been taken. I think where a leader is like that, and again, I'm just thinking of the current situation. We had a huge change, a massive change politically recently. And I don't normally go down the political route, but they can do what they like because they've got such a huge majority. And it's really interesting listening to the way people are viewing the leadership now, the Labour leadership now, to what they were saying before the election took place. And the fact that they're making decisions now that don't sit well with how they promoted themselves beforehand, that's causing conflict, of course.
Yeah.
But for the person at the top, truthfully, if they can come out and share why they're making those decisions, the reasons behind them, be honest about it, and explain the sort of future progress that they see and what's going to happen, the changes that they're making, what's going to happen in the future, I really wouldn't have a problem with that, because again, it's a thankless task. It's not something that I would particularly want to do. Where there's a problem, of course, always seems to be where they're saying one thing and doing another, particularly if they're saying one thing that you should do, but they're doing the opposite. And that seems to have happened too often in that circle, certainly in the UK. Have you come across that within a corporate situation where people are telling you or instructing you to do things one way, but actually they're not doing that at all, or they're behaving in a different way completely?
Absolutely. And sometimes they don't even realize they're doing it. So for me, that's integrity. And we use that word a lot. And a lot of people will say integrity is a value. A lot of organizations have integrity up on the wall as their value. And for me, integrity is doing what you say you'll do. So I wrote a paper about this a while ago, and I used a kind of dumb example. But if I say I'm going to go and rob a bank, and I actually do go and rob the bank, that's not trustworthy. It's not good. But I'm living with integrity because I said and I did what I said I was going to do. So there can be a difference between integrity and actually right. So it's all of that kind of combination of, am I doing what I said I'd do, building trust, so people actually trusting because you did what you said you were going to do. And that seemed to be what you just touched on there. And I think there is a lot of that kind of mismatch in terms of partly what people think they've promised versus what people have actually promised, and people's perception of that promise can always be different. And that's, I guess, when we're talking about biases, that's what makes objectivity difficult, is because objectivity for the person who's putting in the new budget might be a little bit different to your objectivity towards someone else, because you're coming with your own biases. So yeah, I think that does happen. And there's a lot of conversation about trust. And there was something else that you said, but it's that alignment of integrity. Are you doing what you promised to do, or telling me if you've changed what you promised to do? Which I guess is also the case, because you might. Some new information might become available. And then as leaders, you need to reserve the right to change your mind. But then you need to take people on that journey. And I think that's where leaders often struggle, is just generally taking people, and it's politicians, it's leaders and organizations, taking people on the journey with them.
Yeah, that's so important. I know the conversations around sort of in the corporate world, particularly on staff retention, there's a lot more facts and figures to go by, but there's also a lot more realization that if someone doesn't feel a part of the world of that particular business, if they don't actually feel necessary in there, they're a lot more likely to go off sick, to look for another job, to do only what they have to do rather than going the extra mile and doing something else for the company. But where an employee feels that they're invested in the business, that their opinions are valued, that even if they've only got a job that's quite lowly, but it's valued and appreciated and noticed, then they are much less likely to go off sick. They're much less likely to sort of finish on the dot of 5, shoved away and off they go. If there's something to be finished, they'll finish it because they feel like they're giving something back to the company. So do you find that you're working with people, or have you come across people that are discovering that for themselves, or putting it into practice?
When you say discovering the people or the leaders?
The leaders really discovering that for their company, for their business to grow, there is a difference in how they need to treat their employees.
I think people recognize it, and I think people talk about it. I'm not sure about in practice, because it gets complicated. And I've got a funny story, and this was very early when I first started working. So I was still in my early 20s, just out of university in South Africa. And we had a restructure in the department. And we walked in one day and we were told that there was a restructure. And me and my wisdom, 22 years old or whatever I was, I went to the general manager and I said, Brian, we didn't know anything about this. And he said, oh, Glenda, sometimes when we do things in organizations, we've got to take people out of it. And I said to him, but Brian, when an organization is made out of people, how can you take the people out of it? And that's just stood with me always. And at our next sort of team meeting, and he was a lot more senior, he had a lot more experience. I was a new kid on the block. I probably should have shut up. He recalled the conversation and he mentioned me in the meeting, and it obviously made an impact. So I just sometimes think maybe people just need to be reminded that organizations are made out of people. And without the people, the organization doesn't kind of exist. So I think people do know. If you look at LinkedIn, if you look at all these things, everybody knows that this stuff must happen. But when the pressure's on and decisions need to be made, then it's hard, because then we go with head and forget heart. So that under pressure, it's so much easier to just make a, let's call it, rash decision with the head based on what we know.
Yes. Yes, I think that's true. And I think a lot of people, when as they move up the ladder into leadership positions, there's an expectation on them. And sometimes they're making decisions that possibly they're not comfortable with themselves, but they feel like that's the decision that they've been employed to make. That's the role that they've now sort of stepped into. And I wonder whether there should be more work on values from the ground up. And rather than, are we looking in the wrong place? Because there's trainings out there now for the leadership of businesses to bring in, to try and help them to take in more diversity and so on. But I wonder if you can really change it from the sort of top down, whether actually some of that training, some of that nurturing should actually be started right from the base level of the first people in, so that as they grow through the company, they're growing and developing with those values to take on board as they sort of step. I don't know if that's something, again, if you come across that, or is it something that would be really good to implement?
I think it would, because it's really cultural. I've seen too many, and there was actually a post that I read on LinkedIn today, and it was talking about values, and they were saying values on the wall are actually a waste. And to some degree, I agreed with that. They said we need to take change some of the structures to change people's behavior, and that will change the culture. And some of those structures are how we actually treat people. So I don't believe that we can tell people to have values, which is often what organizations try and do. So maybe the top tier think that these are the values we should have. The cynic in me says that so many organizations I've worked in or worked with, the values that are on the wall are so aspirational that they're almost the total opposite to what they actually have. So yeah, I think in terms of the shift, we can't just say these are the values we want to have, so thou shalt have the values. So I do think you're right, is somewhere along the line it needs to be, how do we actually create enough of a groundswell? If you've got a new organization, it's easy, you can create that groundswell. If you've got an existing organization, it's a little bit harder. So how do we actually do it? And aspirational values doesn't mean that doesn't mean the behavior that's actually being exhibited. It's aspirational, and be real about that, and don't pretend because it's a value that that's what we do. Because I think that's, if I think about it, I'm actually a little bit on the fly here now. I'm thinking about, so often when new recruits go into an organization, they get shown what the values are. And it's almost like, so what am I supposed to do with that? Does that mean those are the values and I'm just meant to do them? But it's not that clear. Are people actually behaving according to the values, or are those just the values the organization is aspiring to? So
yes,
but it's,
no, that's
yeah.
I was just going to say that fits in with, there was a huge drive, wasn't there, a few years ago now, sort of about having your mission statement, your business mission statement, and like you say, the values on the wall. This is the big picture of this business. This is what we believe. This is what we hold to. But you're right. You can't say to somebody that you just take on, right, this is us, this is our values, and this is what you need to do, because they may not know, they may not have any idea at all of how those values actually work within the organization, or how they're supposed to behave. What difference does it make to their decision making, or to their day-to-day life, or how they treat each other? Because this is where the sort of subjectivity, the heart, comes in, because how they feel that value should be shown in the world is going to be different from how the next person thinks it should be shown.
Absolutely. And they may actually get told that's the value, and then what they're seeing doesn't seem to match at all. So straight away, there's a disconnect between the value that they've been told there is, what they see acting out, and then potentially then at odds with their own values. And that's one of the things when I work with clients, at whether it be from a personal perspective or organizational perspective, I do find people actually really struggle to differentiate between what they want their values to be, what they think other people expect their values to be, and what they actually are valuing. And if individuals are struggling with that, organizations will be doing it exponentially times by all the people in the organization. So it is challenging, but that's probably why we try and do objective decision making, because that is by definition the objectivity people say, it's value-free decision making. So, but now we're saying there are values, so we're acknowledging that decision making is subjective. So we've really got to work at what those values are underpinning those subjective decisions.
Fascinating stuff. Well, we've covered a lot of ground there, Glenda. I would love the listeners to know a little bit more again about you. Where can they find you? How can you particularly help them? Obviously, you've mentioned it earlier on, but specifically, what could they come to you for help with? And tell us a bit about your book as well.
So my book, Kicking Out the Bucket List, interestingly enough, talks about living with intention and passion. And to me, that links quite closely with this, because intention you could almost see as objectivity, and passion being the I do it from my heart. And so the fact that the book actually focuses on both, it really says to people, think about what you really want to do and sort of get on it and do it. So that's kind of the book. So from my perspective, if people read the book, they can work through their lives and what they want to focus on, and their own it helps them through a decision-making process. And one of the people who pre-read my book actually said that's what he liked about it. He's read a lot of books where people tell him what to do. He liked it because I made him think about making decisions, but they weren't necessarily the same criteria. I wasn't telling him that these are the criteria he should use. I was helping him do that. So that's kind of my book side of things. I try and do the same when I do coaching, particularly if it's one-on-one coaching. So personal or corporate coaching, it's very much about the person and where they're at. One of the things that I like doing is allowing people the opportunity to look back on their lives, because what they can learn from their past can make a big difference to what they can do in the future and to leverage. And it's funny how we've got this thing about we must live in the present and not be hamstrung by the past. And I agree with that, but sometimes we lose out some of the learnings and the things from the past. That's where I can sort of help people look at the past, work out, and then what we do is we look at, interestingly enough, their strengths, their values, what lights their fire, and what they can do to help other people in the world or to change the world. So it's the grounds for their decision-making going forward. So it links quite nicely with this. And because it does have values, what lights your fire, I guess by default, I didn't do it consciously, but it is that sort of heart decision. And I've been able to help a number of people who have had very bias towards head making decision actually let go of some of that and be able to embrace that sort of subjective decision making. If anybody does want to get me, probably the easiest is through my website, mitchell.news. It's different to most people's websites because it shows who I am. So it's got a whole lot of reflections of what I do and a lot of activities and experiences that I've been through. Because a lot of what I want to do is trigger people to think about life and what the options are in life. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Love it. Well, we'll be sharing some information about Glenda alongside this recording. And if you've got questions for her, do reach out and have a conversation. And similarly, if you've got some input to this discussion really about how can we lead from the heart, how does it start, and how does it affect our decisions that we make with our head, then I would love to hear from you, because I would love to explore that further with you also. So follow us, listen to us, and share us. And get in touch so that we can meet with you too and take things further. Thank you for listening. Thanks, Glenda, for coming along.
Thank you.